Chapter 3. That night, a wind rose across the camp, creaking the van like a ship in a storm. Wild Boy pulled his coat tighter around him and nestled in the bundle of sacks that formed his bed. Wherever the travelling fair pitched, the freak shows always closed by sundown. Even the most desperate showmen weren't prepared to spend all evening throwing out drunks and breaking up fights, because at night the fairground turned savage. Wild Boy knew the scenes well. Naphtha lights and oil lamps lit, grinning, sweaty faces as drunken crowds danced through a haze of steam and tobacco smoke. Some people shrieked from behind carnival masks, black-feathered monsters or eerie white faces with long, crooked noses. Others propped up booze stalls, swigging from pots of beer and pints of gin. The dancing booths rocked and pounded to the sound of violins, while gangs of ruffians prowled the path, knocking off hats and shrieking, "Ha ha, ha ha!" Often, Wild Boy sat for hours watching it through a crack in the wall. It was the only time he ever relaxed, forgetting about his own life and exploring those of others. He sometimes felt as if he was floating through the crack and in among the scenes outside, seeing everything. But that night, he couldn't calm down. It wasn't just the fight and the show, it was this place too. Greenwich was not far from Southwark and his old workhouse. The memories were still painful, of all those times that strangers had come to see him in his room. His heart had surged with the hope that they'd come to take him away to a different life, a normal life. But really, they'd just paid Master Bledlow to see the freak. And today, he'd got carried away again in that same stupid fantasy. He should have known better by now. He'd never be anything other than the savage spectacle of Wild Boy. He slid across the van and spied through another hole, hoping he'd see something to take his mind off things among the backstage jumble of prop carts and supply wagons that spread behind the path. Nearby, two other freak show performers, the human colossus and the living skeleton, were fighting with tent pegs. The oldest woman in the world, the bearded lady, and Mr. Peculiar crowded around, goading them and gambling on the result. Wild Boy's eyes widened as he watched the scene intently. His breaths grew deeper, rustling the hair on his cheeks. "Hey, Mutt! Ugly Mutt!" Augustus Finch sat on the edge of his camp bed, greasy black and white hair hanging down over his face. He picked mud from the hobnails of his boots and drank deeply from his third bottle of beer. Drinking was Finch's favourite activity. After dark, it was his only activity. "Get me another beer, Mutt!" Wild Boy shoved a bottle into the showman's hand, fighting the urge to throw it at his face. He glanced up at the deep red birthmark that stained the cheek beneath the showman's scars. The mark, Wild Boy knew, was why Finch's father had beaten him, because his son had looked different to other people. "What are you gawping at?" Finch snarled. The showman put a hand against his cheek. "I said, what are you looking at, Mutt?" "Nothing," Wild Boy said. "Ain't looking at nothing." The door opened and a sack of firewood thumped into the entrance. Sir Oswald followed it, pulling his legless body up the steps and into the van. "Evening all," he puffed. Wild Boy rushed up to help, although Sir Oswald's arms were so strong he had no trouble lifting the sack. The man spent half of his life fixing up this van, screwing springs to the axles or bolting pipes to the walls. Beneath the banners, the wooden walls were crisscrossed with tubes like the scars on Finch's face. "Extraordinary ventilation," Sir Oswald often explained. "Incredible new heating system. Wait until you feel the suspension, Master Wild. You will think we are gliding over ice." As far as Wild Boy could tell, none of the repairs had made any difference. The van was still cold, it still stank, and it rattled terribly as they travelled over country roads between the fairs. Rather, he thought that Sir Oswald kept working simply because he had to. Like him, he had no other place to go. That was just a guess, though. Wild Boy had a harder time reading Sir Oswald than he did anyone else at the fair. His friend had streaks of grey in his hair and wrinkles on his face, but he moved as fast on his hands as any young man on his feet. He called himself Sir Oswald, but Wild Boy had no idea if the title was real. He kept an old clothes chest in the corner of the van, but he didn't store much in it, so eventually Wild Boy gave up searching for clues. He was just happy that Sir Oswald was his friend, the first and only friend he'd ever had. "Watching the fight, eh?" Sir Oswald said. He peered through the crack in the wood. "The Colossus versus the Skeleton. Not much of a contest there. Used to box a little myself, you know, back when I had pins. Mind you, never against a brute the size of the Colossus." The living skeleton will win, Wild Boy said. Poppycock, the man is so thin, I can count his ribs through his vest. He was in the army. I've never heard him say that. The Wild Boy doubted that anyone had. Few of the freaks spoke about their past. Some found it too depressing to speak of happier times. Others, like him, simply had no happier times to speak of. Sir Oswald leaned closer to the crack, studying the skeleton curiously. Master Wild, how could you possibly know that he was in the army? See the white bits of his eyes, Wild Boy said. Barely. They've got black specks in them. They're powder burns from musket fire. You see the same on soldiers about the fair. Perhaps you do, Master Wild. And look how he folded his coat, and that old tattoo on his arm. Army bloke, no doubt about it. Watch this now. Outside, the living skeleton swung a fist. The human colossus fell to the mud with a splash and a mighty thump. Outstanding, Sir Oswald said. Master Wild, you do have an extraordinary skill. Ain't no skill, Wild Boy said. It's just looking. Poppycock. Wild Boy shrugged. It was just what came from years of being locked up with nothing to do but watch the world and dream that he was someone else. It wasn't just his eyes that were sharp either. Confined to that room, he'd learned to separate individual sounds from the roar of the city, the barks of different dogs, or the rattle of particular carriages. He could distinguish between hundreds of smells and had taught himself to read just from posters and placards he'd seen through the window. He didn't see any of it as being particularly skillful. It was just what came from being a freak. Right, Sir Oswald said. I shall test you. He moved across the van and looked through another crack. How about that lady there? What can you tell me about her? Wild Boy didn't like talking about the way he saw things. He knew that it was something different about him, and he hated being different. But he couldn't help himself. It was too much fun. He joined Sir Oswald and peered eagerly out onto the path. Which lady? He asked. The one in the green bonnet. She's a seamstress in a factory. Now, how could you know that? She has blisters on the inside of her fingers, probably from the needles, and her old bonnet's fixed up with different coloured threads, see? Most likely scraps from her factory. Otherwise, why not buy the right colour? Oh, incredible. And how about that man in the smock? He's a boxer. Lost his last fight for money. Scoundrel. He needed it for his new baby, a boy. Ah, well, that's fair game. And that woman over there? She's a flower seller. Now, how could you possibly know that? Because she's selling flowers? They slid back from the wall, both laughing. Wild Boy felt a warm glow inside. He realised that he was proud to have impressed Sir Oswald. What are you two snickering at? Said Augustus Finch. The showman, half asleep and fully drunk, sat up on his bed. Again, he covered the birthmark on his cheek. You're laughing at me, ain't you? He hurled a bottle across the caravan. It smashed against the wall, showering Sir Oswald with beer and broken glass. Hey! Wild Boy yelled. He grabbed a bottle to throw back, but Sir Oswald grasped his arm. Don't, Master Wild. Wild Boy knew he was right. Picking a fight with Finch was a bad idea. Over the past few years, he'd seen the showman gorge eyes, bite off noses, even cut off a man's tongue up in Liverpool. But the anger that often overwhelmed Wild Boy had returned, like a drum beating inside him. He couldn't calm down. Clean up that mess, Finch said as he slumped back on his bed, and get me another drink. Sir Oswald's hand tightened on Wild Boy's arms. A sad smile spread across his leathery face. Things will get better, Master Wild. You will see. Wild Boy tried to return the smile, but it wouldn't come. He wondered how his friend always remained so hopeful. Sir Oswald had performed in a freak show. He'd suffered the same abuse, but still he really believed that life would get better for people who looked different. Here you are, Mr. Finch, Sir Oswald said, placing the beer bottle in the showman's hand. Clean that up, you old runt, Finch said. Sir Oswald slid back, revolted by the sight of the showman's chamber pot on the floor. The reeking bowl was filled with sloppy brown excrement. Finch's face cracked into a sneer. Get it nice and sparkling like. Wild Boy's fists clenched into hairy balls. Stay calm, he urged himself. But his hands shook with anger, and before he could stop himself, he sprang up and yelled at Finch across the van. Clean that up yourself, you old goat. The showman bolted up. What did you just say to me? Nothing, Sir Oswald said. He didn't say anything. Here, I shall clean it up. Don't do it, Wild Boy insisted. He can blimmin' do it himself. Slowly, Augustus Finch rose. Say that again, mutt. Wildboy knew what would happen now. It was the same whenever he stood up to Mr. Finch or to Master Bledlow back when he'd lived at the workhouse. Now he was going to get badly hurt, but he wouldn't back down, even though he felt physically sick with fear. He wouldn't give Finch the satisfaction. He tried to sound brave, but his voice betrayed him and he couldn't stop it from cracking. It just ain't right, he said. Before he could react, the showman struck him across the face and then kicked him hard in the chest. Wildboy tumbled back and crashed against the caravan stove in a burst of sparks. Finch towered over him. "Cry!" he roared. "I want to hear you cry for once, you disgusting, ugly mutt." The sharp taste of blood stung Wildboy's mouth, and his chest screamed where the showman's hobnail boot had hit him. Part of him wanted to curl up and beg Finch for forgiveness, because then the showman would leave him alone. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. He pressed a hand against the wall and rose unsteadily to his feet. He put up a fight. That much he could do. Maybe he could even add a new scar to Finch's collection. Before the showman beat him unconscious, that would be something at least. He hocked up a ball of spit and blood and fired it to the floor beside the showman's boots. "I ain't crying for no one," he said. He expected another attack, but now Finch turned to Sir Oswald. The showman's eyes gleamed with ferocity. "And you!" Sir Oswald tried to crawl away, but Finch dragged him back and thrust his face at the chamber pot. "You can lick that up now, runt." Wildboy knew he should leave. He could sleep in the stable hut, come back tomorrow, but something inside him had snapped. He'd had enough. He reached down and picked up a shard of the broken beer bottle. "You let him go, Finch." Finch snorted. He released Sir Oswald and stepped closer to Wildboy. "You got some nerve, boy, I'll give you that. You say you won't cry? Ha! Before I'm done with you, you're going to scream like a baby." The showman struck out, but this time Wildboy was ready. Ducking Finch's arm, he dropped to the floor and rammed the glass dagger into the showman's boot. A savage roar came from his mouth, rage at 3 years of cruel treatment as he felt the weapon tear through leather and into flesh. Finch gave a blood-curdling scream. He tumbled back and landed on the chamber pot, a wave of foul brown filth washing over his head. Before the showman could get up, Wildboy leaped on him and hit him with the pot. "That's for picking on Sir Oswald," he yelled, "and this is for everything else." He whacked Finch again and then again, harder. With each strike, his panic mounted and more tears filled his eyes. He knew he had to run. He had nowhere to go, but he had to run. Dropping the pot, he jumped over the showman and burst through the door. Sir Oswald cried out for him to stop, but he was already gone. His long coat swished red and gold as he fled the freak show and into the fair. That's all for now. Bye.